nombre es Luciana Paoletti, soy gerente de comunicaciones y contenidos en IDEA y es para mí un honor acompañarlos hoy como conductora de este evento. Tenemos por delante una jornada muy intensa donde vamos a tratar de entender cuáles son las oportunidades y los desafíos que se le generan a Argentina a partir de la rejerarquización de la seguridad energética como tema a nivel global. Nos gustaría invitarlos a que vayan compartiendo en redes sociales su experiencia en este evento usando el hashtag experiencia IDEA Energía. Ahora sí, vamos a darle la bienvenida a Daniel González, director ejecutivo de IDEA, quien va a hacer la apertura de este evento.
Bueno, gracias Luciana. Buen día a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Y arrancando con los agradecimientos, primero que nada, a todas las empresas, sponsors, que los ven en los carteles, que sin ellos este evento y estos eventos que hacemos en IDEA no serían posibles. Nosotros estamos viendo cada evento, cada año, récord de participantes que muestra que el empresario argentino quiere participar, quiere decir las cosas y tenemos siempre propuestas para hacer. En ese sentido, hubo un comité que se puso al hombro la organización de este evento y quiero agradecerles a cada uno de ellos personalmente, que lo lideró Marcos Bulgeroni, pero Gaby Aguilar, Ricardo Marcus, Daniel de Nigris, Ricardo Rodríguez, Pablo Ferrero, Bernardo Andrus, a todos ustedes muchísimas gracias y también Luciana Pauletti, que recién conocieron, y Jimena Camperi del grupo del staff de IDEA. Hace unos años ya que empezamos a hacer estos eventos. Hemos venido siempre a la provincia de Neuquén, la mayoría de los que están acá en el escenario y muchos de ustedes han venido a distintos lugares para estar en uno de los lugares donde se genera energía para Argentina. Digo uno porque podríamos hacer este evento en cualquier otro lugar de la Patagonia, en Chubut, en Santa Cruz, en Río Negro. La podríamos hacer en el norte argentino, donde además de producción de hidrocarburos históricamente se producen renovables, se produce litio. Lo podríamos hacer en Mendoza, en San Juan, en las provincias productoras de bios como Tucumán, Córdoba o Santa Fe. La podríamos hacer hasta en la provincia de Buenos Aires, donde se refina la mayoría del petróleo que se produce en Argentina y donde también se generan energías renovables. Con lo cual, una de las bendiciones claramente que tenemos en Argentina es que producimos energía de calidad y a costos razonables en todo el país. El año pasado hablamos de transición energética, algo de qué energías, pero sobre todo cómo desarrollamos las energías a partir de los recursos que tenemos en Argentina y cómo acompañamos eso, cómo acompañamos la transición energética. En ese momento acababa de suceder la invasión rusa a Ucrania y nos preguntamos, bueno, ¿qué va a pasar con el precio del petróleo? ¿Qué impacto va a tener en transición energética? Y lo que hemos visto en este año es que cada vez más los países se preguntan, bueno, ¿qué hay de la seguridad energética? ¿Cómo nos aseguramos que nuestros países pueden desarrollarse, sus empresas, sus habitantes? Y seguridad energética tiene que ver no solo con la disponibilidad de los recursos en materia amplia, sino también con el costo razonable de esos recursos energéticos. No es inconsistente para nada con transición energética, de hecho vamos a hablar de cómo conseguimos esa seguridad energética, que es mucho más que autoabastecimiento de petróleo, muchísimo más que eso, y cómo lo hacemos en forma amigable con el medio ambiente. Tenemos un programa muy comprimido, paneles de 20, 25, 30 minutos como mucho, así que vamos a pedir a todos los expositores que mantengan sus tiempos. Y es un programa donde tenemos de todo. Tenemos a los funcionarios más relevantes para nosotros en el sector, desde el Ministro de Economía, que va a estar en forma virtual, la Secretaria de Energía, a quien agradecemos su presencia en persona. En este caso vamos a tener a alguien que nos va a hablar del escenario internacional, vamos a tener los principales consultores energéticos del país para poner números y un poco de realismo a muchas de las cosas que escuchamos y que se hablan, pero acá con conocimiento de causa. Vamos a tener a los principales sindicalistas petroleros, porque nosotros creemos claramente que el desarrollo no es solamente un tema de recursos naturales, sino fundamentalmente de personas. Vamos a tener a los principales empresarios del sector petrolero, petróleo y gas. Vamos a hablar de infraestructura, vamos a hablar de energía eléctrica, vamos a hablar de biocombustibles, vamos a hablar de litio, vamos a hablar de hidrógeno, con lo cual es un programa amplio, muy diverso desde el punto de vista de pensamiento. Vamos a tener los los últimos secretarios de Energía también, mostrando un poco la relevancia de la institucionalidad, de la continuidad de las políticas en Argentina. Así que les decía, es diverso en cuanto a las personas, los temas, el tipo de energía, el pensamiento. No es tan diverso como hubiéramos querido en cuanto a género. Es un poquito mejor que el año pasado, pero bueno, siempre estas cosas nos interpelan de qué manera esta industria puede hacer espacio para que se sigan desarrollando mujeres en el sector energético, y ojalá algún día podamos tener mitad y mitad en el escenario. Claramente es un valor para nosotros en IDEA y hacemos lo mejor posible para tener a todas las mujeres que representan al sector presentes. Ojalá del evento surjan una serie de disparadores que nosotros podamos trabajar en los próximos 6 meses de camino al coloquio IDEA, que va a ser 4 y 5 y 6 de octubre en Mar del Plata. Ese es el objetivo, que encontremos puntas de ovillo para desarrollar y para usar el coloquio como una buena caja de resonancia para hablar de políticas que tienen que ver con el sector. Vamos a hablar de muchísimas otras cosas, obviamente, y que esas propuestas que terminemos generando podamos ponérselas enfrente a los candidatos que en ese momento ya van a estar con mucha claridad a pocas semanas de las elecciones. Un último gracias al gobernador de la provincia, que nos recibe como siempre, al ex gobernador Zapá, que saludé recién ahí afuera. Así que a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias. Y con eso me gustaría darle la bienvenida a Daniel de Nigris, CEO de ExxonMobil Exploration Argentina. Hola, Daniel.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buen día, ¿cómo estás?
Bueno, vamos juntos a introducir el primer panel. Tuvimos una linda charla el lunes con Bob Dudley. Por ahí, para los que están más cerca del negocio petrolero, Bob Dudley es un nombre conocido, pero ¿por qué no contás vos, Daniel, por qué es tan relevante lo que nos contó Bob?
Sí. Bueno, buenos días y gracias, Daniel, IDEA, también por la oportunidad de participar aquí. Bob es muy importante, ha sido muy importante para la industria. Tiene una experiencia muy importante también para compartir en la visión internacional del negocio. A medida que nosotros en Argentina estamos empezando a cubrir toda la demanda local y a tener perspectiva de exportación de largo plazo, es muy importante la mirada de Bob en cuanto a dónde va a ir el producto que nosotros vamos a enviar al mundo, ¿no es cierto? Ese entorno está muy bien descrito por Bob en todo, como oportunidad para nosotros a futuro y también como los desafíos que en el mundo de la energía, en el cual vamos a competir mundialmente, vamos a estar desarrollándonos. Bob, por otro lado, tiene en este momento el rol de ser el líder de la iniciativa climática de petróleo y gas. Esta iniciativa cubre las empresas más grandes del mundo. Es una iniciativa que se lanzó en el 2014 y que apunta a generar acciones efectivas de reducción de emisiones a nivel mundial. Y por otro lado también fue el CEO de BP en el periodo 2010-2020. Tiene mucha experiencia también durante ese periodo, inclusive aquí en Argentina, y también en las capacitaciones, en las capacidades previas que tuvo. También trabajó en Rusia y en lugares donde hoy realmente cuando uno mira las perspectivas geopolíticas, su opinión es súper valiosa en lo que está pasando en el mundo.
Sí, incluso agarró BP post-Macondo en una época de precios de petróleo bajos, así que desafío enorme que tuvo. Pero aparte, como dice Daniel, él es el chairman de la UGCI. Recuerdan que el año pasado tuvimos acá a Björn Otto Sverdrup, que sería el CEO de la UGCI, con lo cual uno habla de transición, otro seguridad energética, pero muestra claramente una continuidad. Así que con eso lo vamos a pasar por video, lo grabamos a Bob el lunes, así que todo suyo.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Hello, Bob. It's really good to see you again. So thank you for joining, and also thank you for your availability to share with us some of the insights you may have around the current complexities on the energy sector. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Danielle. It's great. It's a real privilege to join the group there, and it's great for me to sort of be back in Argentina.
All right, you're more welcome. So, Bob, a lot has been said regarding energy transition in the last few years, but only last year many governments started worrying about energy security. The geopolitical disruptions of the war in Ukraine and the continuing effects of COVID pandemic have contributed to a global energy crisis. So in your opinion, what has changed with the war in Ukraine? And are these changes expected to be long-lasting?
Well, it's a really good question about what's changed. And I would say a year and a half ago, governments, policy workers, NGOs, and academics everywhere around the world were very confidently announcing that there were great geopolitical benefits of the coming transition to clean, green energy. And overall, they were saying that the shift to new sources of energy, mainly renewables, mostly what they were referring to, but that it would aid the climate efforts, most certainly, but also end the geopolitics of the old oil, gas, and coal energy order. And I think that was a very popular message to citizens around the world. I think, Danielle, in reality, it was never a realistic message, quite frankly. It was always going to take longer than people wanted or were promised, and certainly much more expensive than people wanted or could even imagine. So I think most politicians or academics don't realize the sheer size and complexity of the world's energy system and how interconnected it is. And that was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That invasion has changed everything, in my view, almost overnight. So what was, and we all used to talk about it, the dual challenge of clean and affordable energy, almost became the energy trilemma very, very quickly of clean, affordable, and what's called sustainable energy. But really, when people talk about sustainable energy, I think they're talking about security of supply. So yes, we are now, in my view, in a very serious world of, I would say, energy insecurity. And I think we're just the beginning of a decade of this, in my view. And I'll mention, maybe why. You go back to 1999, 81% of the world's energy came from oil, gas, and coal. You look at 2022, 81% of the world's energy came from oil, gas, and coal. So what's changed now is we have very volatile pricing. We've got changes all over the world in oil and gas flows, physical flows around the world. And countries are moving to, I would say, less cooperation in energy to more my country first. So the free markets have been affected by this. I mean, I think you all know, and you'll see it, you probably see it in Argentina as well, that the supply chains are disrupted and they've become certainly more complex. And some people say it's now not only energy insecurity, but food insecurity has also started. I mean, some of the statistics about food, 20% of the world's calorie consumption comes from grain, and about 40% of the grains in the world of wheat and sunflowers come from Russia and Ukraine. So we're in a new world here. And in addition, Danielle, I think the invasion comes at a time of not just energy tensions, but much more heightened tensions. I would call it big power tensions. And between the US, this is only going to get more difficult because it involves most countries around the world, and countries are being asked to take sides, and some don't want to. So energy is very, very complex. So yes, I think the war kicked off by the invasion in Ukraine has certainly made the world change differently. And I think it's going to change the pace of the transition, unfortunately.
Well, speaking of transition, something that I wanted also to ask you is, do you think that energy security is contradictory to energy transition? And also, is it reasonable to think that these political events will accelerate the transition in places like Europe, while at the same time serve as an incentive to develop hydrocarbons in places like the US and even Argentina?
Well, there was a time after the war started, I thought, well, this is going to accelerate the energy transition. And as it's gone on longer now, and I've seen things like the high prices that have happened, particularly natural gas prices And it's almost unimaginable to me that today there's more coal in absolute terms burned today than ever in history. So, this is not good for the energy transition. And I actually don't know any scenario in the transition where natural gas should be displacing coal to get there. To me, that's one of the first things that should happen. So, no, I think it's set it back a bit. I think in Europe, they were very fortunate this last winter because the weather was not so cold, but they got through it. And if next winter is cold, I think Europe will continue to have some problems. I don't think we've seen a crisis in energy yet. It's a mini crisis or whatever. The crisis comes when people can't keep the lights on and can't keep people warm. And we're not quite there in the world. And I think it's also become unclear that the supply chains around the energy transition with electric batteries, solar panels and all is now, the majority of them come from China, as do many of the minerals needed in the battery production and the energy, the new cleaner technologies. So I think it's becoming very, very complicated, and it's going to require hopefully more global cooperation, and we're not on that track just yet. So I'm concerned, and of course I'm very committed to the transition, but I'm also a realist.
And let me ask you, Bob, also, in your capacity as chairman of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, known as OGCI, could you please explain the role of this entity and maybe elaborate some more on the action plans and strategy of this entity as well?
Yes, I'd say thank you, Daniel. There's probably three main focuses of the organization, which was found just before the Paris Accords that were reached. And at that time, it was 8, and now it's 12, the world's largest oil and gas companies. And that group produces around 30% of the world's oil and gas. It's not only European companies, it has a number of national oil companies, Saudi Aramco, Petrobras is part of it, CNPC is part of it, the European majors, and then in the last 3 years, Exxon, Chevron, and Occidental joined it, and they've been great contributors to it. So it's 12. And it started out in 2016. We decided natural gas methane emissions or methane emissions was a really low-hanging fruit in the transition. So we came together and said, let's set some targets in reducing our own natural gas emissions. I'll say that. And so we set targets and realized we all had different languages. We had all different methodologies. And it took us about 1.5 years, actually, to come up with a way we could agree on what our missions were. And then we started setting targets of intensity. And so we've now, over the years, dropped that to we're below 0.2% methane emissions. But probably the more astounding figure is the 12 companies have reduced their absolute emissions of methane by 40%. So that's one thing we've been doing, and we've set up some pledges. We now have 60 companies that have joined it. As I told Marcos from Pan American one time, because he was interested in joining it and others do, and I said, well, it's a pretty large organization. We're very open about what we do, but it's also a very expensive organization to join. It comes with, for example, a commitment to invest in $1 billion fund that we set up in 2016 on clean and new energy transition technologies. That's done really well, and Exxon has been a real contributor with that. And then in addition to that, it won't be too long before we'll launch another fund, because many companies come to us and say, we'd like to invest with you, because they know if you can do the due diligence with 12 of the biggest companies in the world, it must be the most rigorous due diligence processes. So we're going to set up another fund with not only the OGCI companies, but others from the outside. We invest in companies currently with companies like GHG Sat, which is a Canadian company that has satellites around the world and measures methane emissions. So we're able to do that not only over our own operations, but really around the world. And we were investing in an aircraft company that does that. We invest in things like CCS. We invest in a cement company that actually takes carbon dioxide out of the air and sequesters it. So we do those sorts of things. And I believe Bjorn Otto, Sverdrup, was with you last year, a year ago.
I would like to have your perspective, Bob, on the upcoming COP28, which will take place in United Arab Emirates by the end of November this year. And a little bit of, what your expectations are around that, what you expect to get out of this conference.
Well, it's a great question, and it's been quite a controversial thing that the United Arab Emirates is hosting COP28, the UN gathering of the world on climate change, and the president who's been formed, and I'm working with that group. Is also a minister of innovation technology, set up something called Masdar, which is a renewable center in Abu Dhabi. And he's also the president of ADNOC, which is, of course, one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world in the Middle East. And immediately after he was announced to do it, there was so much criticism of how one could be in an oil-producing country, and how could somebody who ran an oil and gas company actually drive the process. Well, this man, a guy named His Excellency Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, is somebody who gets things done. And I think that's what's been needed at COPs. COPs generally set targets, but he wants to put together real life programs. OGCI is working with him on, for example, on methane satellite detections, and then putting together programs, and maybe we can work and get global funds to help mitigate it for countries and national oil companies that can't afford to do some of it. So I'm optimistic. Now, this will be the first COP where oil and gas will be represented. And a lot of people don't like that. The one in Glasgow a few years ago, the UN actually asked everybody nobody from oil and gas could be there. Well, as we all know, the oil and gas industry has solved some of the biggest engineering problems on Earth. It has billions of work that it does, invest in many of these new clean technologies. And I don't think the COP can be successful without involving the oil and gas industry in some way. Now, we'll all have to make sacrifices, and we will. But I'm very optimistic about it. This COP, I think if this COP doesn't actually achieve something specific and tangible with projects, I think the whole COP process, personally, I think the whole COP process is in danger of sort of being just a talking shop. So I'm very optimistic about it. And I would stay tuned. That presidency is now traveling all over the world, generating support. And even people like John Kerry in the US is talking about cooperating closely and working together to get coalitions of funding on climate projects. So I'm optimistic, and I'm glad you asked about it.
Well, thank you. And we couldn't really let you go here without asking you about Argentina. So you know Argentina very well from your tenure at BP. So what message would you send to those that need to make investment decisions to develop Vaca Muerta at this point?
Of course, Argentina has been producing oil, back, before in the 1950s and before. So it has a heritage and an engineering heritage of oil and gas production. And I was down in Argentina 8 years ago or so, and could see the similarities between the Vaca Muerta and some of the shales in the United States. And I just thought this really has potential. Sat down with Marcos, for example, at Pan American, looked at the maps. I'm a petroleum engineer, loved doing that, and could see the potential that this had. There were good parts and there were less good parts, but that people should take the risk and explore and start up the frac programs and learn, what kind of hydraulic fracturing can work, and then have a basin like the Vaca Muerta. As it got larger and larger, the supply companies would be there, the infrastructure, the roads would be there to be able to move product out of it. And so I'm quite very pleased to check in and see the progress of the Vaca Muerta. Now, some people, I'm sure, like they do up in Guyana, they tell the Guyanese government, don't invest any more in oil. You don't need any more. There's not going to be any oil used by 2050. Well, I'm not a believer of that. There were 4 billion people on the planet when I started working. a company called Amoco that used to be down in Argentina, and then 8 billion today. And by 2040, 2050, I'm sure we're going to have another couple of billion people on the planet. We're going to need all forms of energy. And Argentina is blessed with this resource. And so doing it effectively, efficiently, cost effectively, I mean, I would really encourage it. And I also, just as an observation, I look at where Argentina is on the map. And so it's got some geographical advantages. It can take oil or gas and take it out into the Atlantic basins, and they can go anywhere. But it's also not so hard, a little bit further into the Pacific basins. And with the tensions evolving, China, Korea, Japan, all those countries would really be interested in products. I think 60 to 70% of China's oil imports come through the Straits of Malacca. So putting oil out into the Pacific has a lot of advantages. And of course, Korea and Japan are also interested. So I would just encourage, develop the resource. Think not only about oil, but if you can do it with natural gas. And I think it's a real blessing for Argentina. So I would take advantage of it, and don't be told to keep it in the ground.
Well, thank you a lot, Bob. Very insightful comments today. We are getting to the end of our time commitment here, but I would like to thank you also on behalf of IDEA and the organizers of this very important conference here in Neuquén. Thank you for your participation today. I'm looking forward to seeing you down here in Argentina at any time.
Thank you, Danielle, and my best to everybody at IDEA.